Put your Bibles, please, to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. I was reading some time ago an interesting book titled "It Should Never Happen at Church." And I admit the title is what caught my attention. And it is an interesting book. And there's quite a few interesting stories in that book. And I just let your imagination run a bit wild in what kind of stories and chapter headings are included in that book. It should never happen at church. And if you've been a Christian long enough, you just imagine the things that an author could write and could include, stories that he or she could include in a book titled, "It Should Never Happen at Church." For example, a treasurer should never embezzle. A preacher, an elder, a pastor should never be charged with DUI. Church leaders should never be on the front pages of a newspaper or at the 6 o'clock news. A church should never be on any news organization accused of being a pedophile or covering up stories of pedophilia. No one that is involved in a church organization should ever be accused of anything that is improper. But things like that happen at church. And I mention this because here last week, the newspaper and the media have been reporting where some religious people and some religion has dominated the news of cover-up of sexual molestation in the church. And I don't say that to try to demean or to put down that religion, because it is sad. The truth is that it happens. You know, in the church, in business meeting, two men should not be so upset at each other that they raise their voices, slam their fists on a table, and stomp out of the room and slam a door and peel out of the parking lot. But it happens. It doesn't say, nor does it announce, nor does it doesn't show love. But it happens. Christians should never gossip, but it happens. Church politics and family ties should never get in the way of selecting the best qualified men to lead the church. But it happens. It certainly does. Truth should never be compromised, but it happens. The men that have been appointed to lead the church should lead the church based on faith, love, and compassion, and nothing less than that. But sometimes all that is compromised because of family ties, or because of weakness, or because of other things. And things that should never happen to church happen. And in Philippians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul, having written a beautiful letter, a beautiful dissertation, if you will, where he talks about humility, when he says, have this attitude exist in you that existed in Jesus, that although he existed in the form of God, did not grasp on to that, but yet he emptied himself, and he's talking about humility, he emptied himself and took on the form of man, and even to the point of dying on the cross, he says that's the attitude that needs to exist in every single one of you who are members of the church at Philippi. And yet they were supposed to read this epistle, this letter, in every church, even throughout the ages, including us. He is saying you need to be humble like Jesus was humble. And then we get to the 4th chapter. As he's winding down this letter, notice when he says in verse 1, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, whom I long to see, my joy and crown, in this way stand firm in the Lord, my beloved." And just when you think that he's going to just speak all kinds of positive things, and we've been warned in our politically correct and politically positive climate, and even at church, don't mention people's names publicly. If you have a beef with someone, go to them in private, because that's what Jesus says. But notice what Paul says in verse 2, "I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to live in harmony in the Lord." It seems like these two sisters at the church of Philippi had a beef with each other. It seems like these were the sisters that just couldn't get along, or maybe they could, but Paul is just reminding them, keep on getting along. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is that these two sisters had a problem with each other, that they just couldn't get along. So Paul says in this public letter that was to be read publicly at the church of Philippi, and then this letter was to be circulated among the churches. He says, I want these two sisters to get along and hear their names. Now, would your nose be out of joint if one of the elders at church announced and said, "We got a letter from the Apostle Paul, one of the missionaries, and we're going to have this special meeting to read the letter to the church." And as the letter's being read and talking about the humility of Jesus and the deity of Jesus, how he emptied himself and all those great things, and it gets to the point where the letter mentions your name and somebody else's name, and Paul says, "And I want you two to get along," how would you react? Maybe Paul had heard something about you and the other brother or the other sister. You see, when a church has problems that it doesn't get along, or that has members in the church that they don't get along, that they fight and bicker, people find out about that, don't they? So Paul is saying in this letter, I want these two sisters, I'm urging you and I'm urging you to get along. Now, why are we wanting you two to get along? Why? So what are we to do when things that should never happen at church? When things get out of hand? When things explode? What do we do? Do we cover it up? Or do we expose it? What do we do? Well, first of all, may I suggest to you, go to Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 11 to begin our study and to look at our first point. Hebrews 2 and verse 11 to begin with. Let's make sure that we don't expect perfection from each other. You know, we know the truth that the only one that is perfect is God, and that the only human that was perfect was Jesus, that was God in the flesh. So we shouldn't have these expectations that are unrealistic from our brethren, that they be perfect. Because you're not perfect, I'm not perfect, and no one else is going to be perfect. To expect perfection from imperfect people is just simply unrealistic. In Hebrews 2 and verse 11, we read that for both he, that is, God who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. We have been redeemed, but we are still in the process of being sanctified. In other words, we're a work in progress. You and I are a work in progress. And so many times we want to hold each other up to a standard by which we can't meet ourselves. This is one of the problems that the Pharisees had, that Jesus called them hypocrites. When the Pharisees were wanting people to carry loads, that is, wanted them to keep the traditions of the fathers and men, that Jesus says that they themselves aren't willing to move with one finger. And he called them hypocrites. So you and I should not have unrealistic expectations of imperfect people. Romans chapter 3 and verse 10. Someone, or the Apostle Paul, there in Romans 3, gives us a list of about 14 nuggets from the Old Testament that reminds us of how unrighteous we are, how imperfect all of us are. And in verse 10, he gives us one where he says, there is none righteous, not even one. In this building, in this auditorium, at this very moment, look around, beginning with you, and apply this passage. There is none righteous, yes, not even one. So make sure that your expectations are realistic. Verse 11, there is none who understands, there is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongue they keep deceiving. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That is describing us. Although Paul reaches way back from the Old Testament, from the book of Psalms and from the book of Isaiah, he reaches way back from there to make his points. The point that he makes very loudly is this: you and I are imperfect creatures. And notice how he tops it off in verse 23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4 and verse 2, Paul urging them to get along. He urges them for the sake of peace and unity in the church, for the sake of their growth, for the sake of reaching as many people as they can with the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. He says, I want you two to get along. There's no worse feeling in the family of God than to walk into a building and feel the tension that can be cut with a knife because a couple of hard-headed Christians just can't get along. Walking on eggshells because I don't want to tick somebody off. And Paul says, I'm urging you, get along. And then this goes beyond I have a pet peeve. And I don't like it when you breathe through your nose or breathe through your mouth. You know, it's like a marriage. At first, all that stuff is cute. But as time goes on, that cute stuff, It wears on you. And you have to learn to get along, learn to put up with it, learn to move on in order to get along in your marriage. And in the family of God, we got to learn to do that. And the way some people solve that, they say, I'm just going to pack my toys and move to a different congregation, because I just can't stand sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so. And if that's the attitude that we have, we need to reread the 7 letters that Paul wrote to the churches in Asia. They were putting up with the teaching of Jezebel, the teaching of Balaam. They're putting up with some gross immorality in the church. And not once did Jesus say, pack up your bags, gather up your toys, and go play somewhere else. He says to them, you need to keep what is holy and right. Fix what is broken. Don't leave. So what do you do when what should never happen happens at church? Make sure that your expectations are realistic. And keep yourself in check. And realize that you are as imperfect as the one that is sitting beside you, in front of you, or behind you. We all know the person that sings way too loud or way off key, or the one that kicks the seat behind you, or the one that always is opening the can. You see, those are things that really don't amount to much of anything. And that just shows our childish attitude sometimes. And hence, it merited Paul writing a public letter to the Philippians and saying, you two ladies, you just got to get along. Work together. Not against each other. For the sake of the church, for the sake of the gospel. Get along. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15. It is a trustworthy statement deserving full acceptance that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. And notice what Paul says, among whom I am the greatest or the chiefest, the biggest offender of all sinners. That's who I am. Yet for this reason, because I am the greatest sinner, I found mercy, so that in me as a foremost Jesus Christ might demonstrate his perfect patience as an example for those who believe in him for eternal life. I want you to notice what Paul is claiming here. That he considered himself the biggest and the greatest of all sinners. That he was the biggest pest to Jesus. Because instead of helping Jesus, he was trying to destroy the cause of Jesus. So Jesus demonstrates to Paul his love and mercy by appearing to him and giving him the option of either being condemned to hell eternally or believing in Jesus, accepting the gospel plan of salvation and being saved. And Paul says, I chose plan B. I chose to be saved. And then God or Jesus demonstrated patience towards me. How did he demonstrate patience? He took the time to teach me, to mold me, to fix me, and to lead me to become his chosen instrument. And if we would take that time to learn and to get to know our brethren better, instead of trying to destroy them or defeat them or run away from them, we could do a lot more in the kingdom of Christ. Secondly, in Acts chapter 20 and verse 29. Acts chapter 20, verse 29, the Apostle Paul has given us many years in advance, ample warning that the majority of the problems that the church would face would not come from those that would persecute the church from the outside, but would come from those that were inside the church. They would come from people that would want to, for some pathetic and sick reason, would want to destroy the peace and harmony that the family of God enjoys. So he says in Acts 20 and verse 29, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come among you, not sparing the flock. Now, these wolves that he talks about aren't going to all of a sudden say to you, by the way, my intentions are to destroy this church. They will do so in the friendliest of ways. They will dress themselves up as meek lambs, as beautiful, fluffy, white, cuddly sheep, and work themselves until they have finally been either exposed or until they have savagely destroyed the peace and harmony in the church. So Paul gives us that heads up. So what should we do? We should always be on the alert. He teaches us that the greatest challenges facing the church today come from within, and they're called pride, jealousy, anger, and division. And we shouldn't ignore that. And that we should, as individuals, constantly guard ourselves from pride, jealousy, contention, anger, and division. James chapter 2 and verse 13. We should also consider that the church needs grace, mercy, just as much as does the individual. One of the beauties of knowing more than one language is the ability to be able to appreciate the value of words. So in English, we say thank you. But in Spanish, we say gracias. And gracias is grace in English. And grace in English means a few things. Like, let's say grace. And we say grace usually only for a meal. We don't say grace before we go to bed. We say a prayer before we go to bed. We say a prayer when we wake up. We say prayers for several things, but we usually only say grace before a meal. But grace also means mercy. And when we say gracias in Spanish, that means thank you. So what I want us to think about, if we were to put all these words in a circle, grace, appreciation, thank you, mercy, all means the same thing. We use it in different contexts in English, but it all means the same thing. Thank you, grace, appreciation, and mercy all means the same thing. So, in James 2 and verse 13, the apostle says, for judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy, and mercy triumphs over judgment. Now you can replace the word mercy with grace And it means the same thing. And the point that the writer is making is this: judgment will be without grace or without mercy to the one that has shown no mercy. If you and I show no patience towards other people, then God will show no patience and no mercy towards us in the day of judgment. Mercy and grace means a lot and will have a lot of worth in the day of judgment. The grace and the mercy that I express and that I show on this earth will have a lot of worth on my account, if you will, in my favor in the day of judgment. So, what should I do, or what should happen when things that never should happen at church? I should be merciful and full of grace and have a forgiving heart. And finally, I should become proactive in order to improve what needs improved. Complaints and criticisms are easy, but it takes effort to invest oneself in a solution. Valerie has started on her own potty training. And the only thing that she does not like is when the light is off in the restroom. We have to make sure that the light is always on. Although she can reach the switch to turn it on and off, if it's off, she will stand there and yell and scream and pitch a fit. And I have taken her hand and forced her finger out of her fist and used it to press that switch for the light to come on. And immediately she turns it back off and continues with her temper tantrum. She wants the light on before she gets to the bathroom. And it reminds me of a proverb that says, "Don't curse the darkness, light a candle." And there are too many adults, too many Christians that curse the darkness instead of lighting a candle. We need to become proactive in order to improve what needs to be improved. God doesn't need white-collar executives in the church, but He needs blue-collar laborers. That's what we need to become. It should never happen at church, but it does happen. And I think the Bible gives us all the tools that are necessary to solve problems when they arise. And Paul began our study with Philippians 4 and verse 2 by saying to Syntyche and Euodia, and they weren't Star Wars people, to get along. And with that letter and those two commandments for those two to get along, he's also telling the church, you need to be proactive in making sure that those two ladies get along. So yes, sometimes things happen at church that should never happen. And when these situations exist, may we be found responding within the context of faith, trying to improve the situation and not make it worse. May God be gracious to our shortcomings, understanding and forgiving. as we try to understand and comprehend and be gracious towards each other with our shortcomings. We are the family of God. And we often sing the hymn that says, God's family. Sometimes we cry together, and sometimes we laugh together. May the times that we cry together be because we're understanding each other and comforting each other. And may the times that we laugh together be because we are celebrating each other's accomplishments. Think about these things as together we stand and sing.